In 1957, 22 monks vanished without a trace from St. Jude's Abbey in Ouray, Colorado. 50 years later, a demolition crew breaking ground for a luxury ski resort would uncover a truth frozen in time, a secret preserved in ice that would shatter a town's foundational myth. The silence of the mountain was about to be broken, and the ghosts of St. Jude's would finally have their story told, not as a legend of faith, but as a testament to greed. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. The autumn of 1957 found St. Jude's Abbey in its usual state of serene isolation. Perched high in the San Juan Mountains, the stone monastery was a world unto itself, governed by the rhythm of prayer, work, and the changing seasons. The 22 brothers who lived there were men of quiet devotion, their days marked by the chanting of psalms, the tending of gardens, and the scholarly transcription of ancient texts. Their life was a deliberate retreat from the modern world below. Leading this cloistered community was Abbot Thomas Finch, a man whose gentle demeanor concealed a core of unyielding principle. He was both a spiritual father to his monks and a practical steward of their home. He understood the harsh realities of their mountain existence and managed the abbey's meager resources with meticulous care. The abbot saw the divine in the order of things, and he felt a profound responsibility to protect the sanctity and peace of his isolated brotherhood from any outside intrusion. That peace began to fray with the arrival of Silas Blackwood. He was a young man then, barely 30, but he carried himself with the confidence of a king surveying his future domain. A prospector with an uncanny knack for finding mineral wealth, Blackwood's ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the surrounding mountain range. He arrived at the abbey not seeking spiritual guidance, but with geological maps and a persuasive, almost predatory charm that immediately put the abbot on edge. Blackwood spoke of progress and prosperity for the struggling town of Ouray. He painted visions of a partnership, suggesting the monks could benefit from the riches he was certain lay dormant beneath their chapel. His offers to purchase the monastery's land were cloaked in the language of philanthropy and community development, but Abbot Finch heard only the dissonant clang of avarice. He saw the hunger in the young man's eyes, a desire that had no place within the sacred walls of St. Jude's. The abbot politely but firmly refused Blackwood's proposals time and again. He explained that the land was not a commodity to be bought or sold. It was a sanctuary consecrated for a purpose that transcended material wealth. Each rejection only seemed to harden Blackwood's resolve. His visits became more frequent, his tone more insistent. The tension between the two men became a silent, simmering conflict, a battle between faith and fortune played out in the abbot's Spartan office. As November gave way to the biting cold of December, the atmosphere within the abbey grew heavy with unspoken apprehension. The monks noticed the change in their abbot, the subtle weariness in his posture, and the distant look in his eyes. The regular appearances of Blackwood's dusty truck winding its way up the mountain road had become a source of quiet dread. The outside world, which they had so carefully kept at bay, was now knocking insistently at their gate, demanding entry. The final days of St. Jude's were marked by an impending sense of doom, amplified by the weather reports crackling over their small radio. A blizzard of historic proportions was churning towards the Rockies, promising to bury the high country under a crushing blanket of snow. For the monks, such storms were a familiar trial, a time to retreat deeper into their faith and self-sufficiency. But this time, the approaching storm felt different, more like a final curtain than a seasonal challenge. On the afternoon of the blizzard's arrival, Silas Blackwood made one last visit. The sky was a bruised, menacing gray, and the wind had begun to howl through the pines. He presented a final generous offer, framing it as a last chance for the monks to escape the coming winter with financial security. Abbot Finch, his patience worn thin, delivered his final refusal. The land was not for sale. The two men parted not with a handshake, but with a cold, piercing silence that held the weight of an ultimatum. That night, the storm hit with apocalyptic fury. Snow fell in blinding sheets, and the wind screamed like a vengeful spirit. The single telephone line connecting the abbey to the town below went dead within the first hour. Shortly after, the radio transmissions ceased, plunging St. Jude's into a profound and total isolation. The monastery and the 22 men inside were completely cut off from the world, swallowed by the white chaos of the blizzard. It was the last anyone would hear from them. Months passed. The winter of 1957-58 was one of the most brutal on record. It wasn't until late April, when the snows began to recede and the mountain passes became navigable, that a search party from Ouray could finally make the arduous journey up to the abbey. They expected to find the monks gaunt and weary from a long winter, but they were not prepared for the unnerving stillness that greeted them. There were no footprints, no smoke from the chimney, no sound but the wind. The scene inside the monastery was even more unsettling. It was a perfectly preserved tableau of interrupted life. In the refectory, half-eaten bowls of stew sat on the long wooden tables, the bread beside them hard as stone. In the scriptorium, a book lay open, its delicate pages awaiting a scribe who would never return. Candles were burned down to their stubs, and the chapel was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no hint of violence or panic. The searchers moved from room to room, their calls echoing in the vacant halls. They checked the dormitories, finding beds neatly made. They inspected the pantries, which were still well stocked with preserved goods, more than enough to have lasted the winter. Every detail pointed to a sudden, inexplicable departure. It was as if the 22 men had simply stood up in the middle of their daily routines and walked out into the blizzard, leaving everything behind. The most baffling element was the complete absence of the monks themselves. An extensive search of the abbey grounds and the surrounding wilderness yielded nothing. No bodies were recovered, no graves were found, no notes were left behind. The men had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the ghost of their former existence. The mystery deepened with every fruitless day of searching, frustrating the local sheriff and fueling wild speculation in the town below. Faced with a complete lack of evidence, the official investigation quickly ran out of steam. The sheriff, overwhelmed and under-resourced, filed a cursory report. Without bodies or any indication of foul play, he was left with only one plausible, if romanticized, conclusion. He declared that the monks, in an act of extreme, perhaps misguided faith, had undertaken a silent pilgrimage into the heart of the storm, perishing in the unforgiving embrace of the wilderness. This narrative, born of necessity and a lack of alternatives, was swiftly accepted. It was a tragic but poetic explanation that offered a semblance of closure. The story of the lost brotherhood of St. Jude's became a cornerstone of local folklore, a haunting tale of devotion and sacrifice told to tourists and passed down through generations. The monks were transformed from missing persons into martyrs, their disappearance a testament to the wild, untamable spirit of the mountains. The abbey itself was left to the elements. Its stone walls crumbled, and its roof eventually collapsed under the weight of countless winters. It became a skeletal ruin, a lonely monument to the town's most enduring mystery. The land, officially deemed abandoned by the state, was eventually put up for auction. The community watched as the very ground the monks had refused to sell was acquired for a pittance by an enterprising young businessman. That businessman was Silas Blackwood. He publicly expressed his profound sorrow over the tragedy, vowing to honor the monks' memory. He then proceeded to build his mining empire on the foundation of their former home. his wealth growing exponentially from the rich silver lodes he had always known were there. The story of the lost pilgrims provided a convenient and poignant cover for his aggressive acquisition of the land, a tragic beginning to his own triumphant story. For 50 years the legend held firm, the open wound of the monk's disappearance scarred over, becoming part of the town's identity. The community of Ouray, now prosperous thanks to blackwood mining, accepted the tale of the pilgrimage as historical fact. The truth of what happened on that stormy December night remained buried, not just under decades of snow, but under a carefully constructed lie that had become as solid as the mountain itself. The children and grandchildren of those who had known the monks grew up with the ghost story. Saint-Étienne, or Jude's became a place of whispered legends, a destination for adventurous hikers who wanted to touch a piece of local history. The memory of Abbot Thomas Finch and his brothers faded from living recollection into the realm of myth, their true fate seemingly lost forever to the annals of time and the silence of the high country. But the mountain had not claimed the monks. It had only been keeping their secret. The official story provided a comforting narrative, but it was a fiction designed to obscure a brutal reality. The truth was not a story of faith leading men into a storm. It was one of greed driving a man to commit an atrocity, confident that the blizzard and the passing of time would erase his sins completely. The empty abbey was not a sign of a spiritual departure. It was a meticulously staged crime scene, its silence not a product of piety, but of a calculated, cold-blooded massacre. The absence of bodies was not a mystery of nature, but the result of a deliberate and gruesome cover-up, a final act of desecration against the men who had stood in the way of a fortune. The legend of the lost pilgrims served its purpose perfectly, allowing a killer to walk free and be celebrated as a hero. It transformed a mass murder into a local tragedy, protecting the guilty and silencing the victims for half a century. The entire town was built upon this foundational lie, its prosperity rooted in a crime that everyone had unknowingly agreed to forget. For 50 years the story held, a testament to the power of a simple, compelling narrative to overwrite a complex and horrifying truth. The world moved on, and the ruins of St. Jude's became just another landmark on a map, its history reduced to a single, misleading paragraph in a tour guide. The real story was waiting, perfectly preserved, for the one thing that could finally shatter the myth. What no one knew was that the final, irrefutable witness to the crime had been left behind, sealed away from the world. A testament written in the final moments, hidden from the killers, was waiting for a future generation to uncover. The carefully constructed silence was about to be broken, not by a voice, but by the relentless advance of progress that had started it all. The truth was much darker than the legend, and its discovery was now inevitable. The year is 2007. 50 years of silence have passed over the San Juan Mountains, a period during which the legend of St. Jude's Abbey calcified into unquestioned history. The world that had forgotten the 22 monks was now returning, not with prayers, but with the roar of diesel engines and the thunder of heavy machinery. Blackwood Development, the modern iteration of Silas's empire, had broken ground on its most ambitious project yet, a luxury ski resort on the very land where the monastery once stood. Progress, it seemed, was finally ready to erase the last physical remnants of the tragic tale. A team of demolition experts, men accustomed to the predictable physics of concrete and steel, moved through the skeletal remains of the abbey. Their task was simple: clear the ruins to make way for the foundations of a sprawling new lodge. The main chapel and refectory had long since collapsed, but the lower levels, particularly the stone-walled cellars, remained remarkably intact, protected by the earth and the perennial cold. It was here, in the subterranean darkness, that the mountain's 50-year-old secret was about to be violently exhumed from its tomb of ice and stone. The operator of a hydraulic excavator, a man named Dave "Sully" Sullivan, was carefully pulling down a section of the wine cellar's foundation. He felt an unusual give, a hollow thud that vibrated through the machine's controls, entirely different from the solid crunch of rock. Halting the powerful arm of his machine, he signaled to his foreman. Something was wrong. The blueprints showed a solid foundation wall, but the impact suggested a cavity, a hidden space that had no business being there. The foreman ordered the crew to investigate the anomaly by hand. Their curiosity piqued. Using sledgehammers and crowbars, the crew chipped away at the crumbling mortar. They quickly discovered it was a false wall, constructed with a different type of stone and a more modern cement mix than the surrounding 19th-century masonry. It was a crude but effective piece of concealment, designed to blend in over time. As they breached the final layer, a rush of frigid, stagnant air escaped the newly opened void, carrying with it a faint, almost sterile scent of deep cold. Peering into the darkness with their flashlights, they saw something encased in a solid block of ice. At first, they thought it was a statue, a forgotten religious icon left behind by the monks. The figure was serene, posed in a posture of quiet contemplation, its hands folded in its lap. The dark wool of a monastic habit was perfectly preserved, every fiber visible through the crystal-clear ice. The man's face was peaceful, his eyes closed, as if in prayer. It was a hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling sight. A perfect time capsule from a lost world. The demolition crew fell silent, overcome by a sudden and profound sense of reverence for what they had found. But as the foreman moved his flashlight beam upwards, the serene image was shattered by a single, horrifying detail. Just above the frozen man's right temple was a small, neat, perfectly circular hole. It was not a wound from a fall or a natural injury. Its precision was unmistakable. It was a bullet hole, a mark of modern calculated violence that had no place in the romantic legend of a spiritual pilgrimage. The peaceful monk had not perished in a storm. He had been executed, his body sealed away in a makeshift tomb of ice to conceal the crime. The work site was immediately shut down, transforming from a construction zone into a state-level crime scene within hours. The Ouray County Sheriff's Department, quickly realizing they were dealing with a case far beyond their resources, called in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. News of the discovery ripped through the small town with the force of an avalanche, unearthing a history that most residents had only known as folklore. The story of the Lost Brotherhood was not a tragedy of faith. It was a cold-blooded murder, and the victim had been waiting half a century to be found. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet, temperature-controlled archive at the University of Denver, Dr. Alistair Finch received the phone call that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. A meticulous historical archivist, Alistair had dedicated his career to preserving the past. But this was not a professional matter. The call was about his grandfather, Abbot Thomas Finch, the man who had led the Brotherhood of St. Jude's. The legend of their disappearance had been a defining, unspoken sorrow in his family, a story he had always felt was incomplete, a wound that never truly healed. Alistair arrived in Ouray less than a day later, the town of his family's history now feeling alien and hostile. The name Blackwood was everywhere, on the mining headquarters that dominated the main street, on the philanthropic plaques in the town square, on the very construction equipment that had unearthed the frozen monk. He felt an immediate, visceral connection between the town's prosperity and his family's loss. He was not just an archivist seeking historical clarity. He was the grandson of a missing man, now presumed murdered, and he was determined to find the truth. He was met at the sheriff's office by Deputy Sheriff Elena Ramirez, a recent transfer from Denver who was young, sharp, and most importantly, an outsider. She was immune to the town's deeply ingrained loyalties and the long shadow cast by Silas Blackwood. She saw in Alistair not a grieving relative, but a valuable asset, a living link to the past with unparalleled knowledge of the Abbey and the men who had lived there. Together they formed an unlikely but determined alliance, united by a shared commitment to the facts, no matter how uncomfortable. The preliminary forensic report confirmed their worst fears and validated Alistair's lifelong suspicions. The body in the ice was identified through dental records, which Alistair had in his family's archives, as Brother Michael, the Abbey's bursar, the man in charge of all financial records. The bullet extracted from his skull was a .22 caliber, common in the 1950s. Most damning of all, analysis of the mortar from the false wall revealed it was a commercial mix that had only become available in the region in the summer of 1957, confirming it was a recent addition. The official narrative of a mass pilgrimage, the story that had defined Ouray for 50 years, was formally and publicly refuted by the CBI. The case of the missing monks was officially reclassified as a homicide investigation. The discovery of Brother Michael's body did not close a chapter. It ripped open a book that everyone thought had been permanently sealed. It begged a terrifying new question. If one monk was murdered and hidden, where were the other 21? The town's comforting ghost story had just become the prelude to a hunt for a mass grave. From his sprawling mountain estate overlooking the town, an 85-year-old Silas Blackwood issued a formal statement. He spoke with the practiced gravitas of a revered patriarch, expressing his profound shock and sorrow at the gruesome discovery. He recounted the tale of the blizzard and the monk's disappearance as he had always told it, framing this new evidence as a tragic and baffling postscript to the town's foundational myth. He pledged his full cooperation with the investigation, vowing to help bring closure to the families of the men he called his friends. Alistair watched the televised press conference from his motel room, his jaw tight with anger. He saw not a grieving philanthropist, but a performer. He recognized the same predatory charm his grandfather had described in his letters, the carefully crafted mask of a man who had built an empire upon a graveyard. He knew, with an instinct that went deeper than evidence, that Blackwood was not just a witness to the past. He was its architect. The battle lines were drawn between the man who owned the town and the man who sought to reclaim its true history. The reopened investigation began with a single chilling photograph, the serene, frozen face of Brother Michael. His preserved body was a silent testament, a 50-year-old accusation that could no longer be ignored. For Alistair, it was the start of a journey into the heart of a darkness that had been allowed to fester for decades. He and Deputy Ramirez began the painstaking work of deconstructing the official story, knowing that every lie they uncovered would bring them closer to a monstrous truth the town had unknowingly protected. The discovery shifted the entire paradigm of the mystery. The question was no longer what happened to the monks, but who murdered them and covered it up so perfectly. The serene abbey, once seen as the site of a spiritual departure, was now viewed through a much darker lens. It was a meticulously staged crime scene. The absence of the other bodies was no longer a sign of a pilgrimage into the wilderness, but a clue pointing to a deliberate and gruesome disposal effort, one that required planning, manpower, and absolute secrecy. Deputy Ramirez began by pulling the original 1958 investigative file. It was shockingly thin, little more than a handful of pages containing a cursory summary of the scene and interviews with a few townspeople. The investigation had been closed with improbable speed by the sheriff at the time, a man who, Alistair would soon discover, later received a substantial and undocumented loan from a young Silas Blackwood to purchase a large parcel of ranch land. The cover-up, it seemed, had begun almost as soon as the crime was committed. Alistair, meanwhile, turned his archivist's eye to his own family's collection of his grandfather's documents. He had letters, abbey ledgers, and personal reflections written by Abbott Finch. He began cross-referencing names, dates, and events, searching for any detail that might have been missed. He was particularly interested in the final letters written in the autumn of 1957, which spoke with increasing alarm about the persistent and aggressive offers from a young prospector who refused to take no for an answer regarding the monastery's land. The town of Ouray became a character in the investigation, its collective memory now a subject of interrogation. The older residents, those who remembered 1957, were reluctant to speak. Their lives and livelihoods were intertwined with Blackwood mining. To question Silas Blackwood was to question the very foundation of their modern prosperity. They clung to the legend of the pilgrimage because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate, that their town's hero and benefactor might be a mass murderer. The atmosphere grew thick with tension. The national media descended on Ouray, broadcasting the story of the frozen monk to the world. The town's carefully curated image as a quaint mountain paradise was being shattered, replaced by a narrative of dark secrets and long-buried crimes. Silas Blackwood used his considerable influence to manage the story, portraying Alistair as an outsider, dredging up old pain for personal reasons, a man trying to tarnish a local legacy out of a misplaced sense of familial grief. Alistair and Ramirez felt the pressure mounting from all sides. They were working against the clock, aware that Blackwood and his allies could be destroying any remaining evidence. Their investigation was a race against a 50-year head start. They knew the key to solving the murder of Brother Michael, and likely the other 21 monks, was not just in forensic evidence, but in dismantling the powerful myth that had protected the killer for half a century. The truth was buried somewhere in the town's history, and they were determined to dig it up. The discovery of the single preserved body was the catalyst, the spark that lit a 50-year-old fuse. It provided the undeniable proof of foul play that had been missing in 1958. It gave a voice to one victim, a voice that now cried out for the other 21 who remained missing. The single bullet hole in Brother Michael's temple was a puncture in the carefully constructed fabric of a lie, and through that hole, a horrifying truth was beginning to bleed out into the present day. The focus of the investigation turned to the Abbey grounds. Forensic teams began a systematic search, using ground-penetrating radar and historical blueprints provided by Alistair. They were looking for any disturbance, any anomaly that might indicate a burial site. The task was monumental. Decades of rock slides, avalanches, and vegetation growth had altered the landscape, concealing whatever secrets it held. They were searching for a needle in a mountain-sized haystack, guided only by the grim certainty that more bodies were out there. Alistair knew that physical evidence alone might not be enough to convict a man as powerful as Blackwood. He needed something more, something irrefutable. He became convinced that his grandfather, a meticulous record-keeper and a man of deep faith, would not have faced his end without leaving some kind of testament behind. He believed the abbot would have found a way to ensure the truth would one day be known, hiding a final record, a last confession, away from the eyes of his killers. The search for the other monks was now intertwined with Alistair's search for this final message. He pored over the abbey's architectural plans, searching for hidden rooms, secret compartments, or hollow spaces. Anywhere a man might hide a small, precious object in his final moments. He cross-referenced this with his grandfather's last letters, looking for any coded language, any biblical allusion or turn of phrase that might be a clue to a location. He was hunting for a ghost, a final whisper from the past. The town held its breath, caught between its revered history and the horrifying new reality. The legend of the Lost Brotherhood was dead, replaced by the grim investigation into the St. Jude's massacre. The romantic folklore had given way to the stark, procedural language of a police investigation. Every resident was forced to re-examine the story they had told themselves for generations, and to wonder what else they had been wrong about. The silence of the mountain had been broken, and its echoes were shaking the town to its core. The discovery of Brother Michael served as a profound turning point, transforming a cold case of missing persons into an active hunt for a killer who had walked free for 5 decades. It was the inciting incident that reignited a long-extinguished fire, promising a reckoning that had been delayed but never entirely escaped. The frozen monk was the first voice to speak after 50 years of silence, and his testimony demanded that the full story finally be told, no matter the cost to the living. Deputy Ramirez secured a warrant to review the early financial records of Blackwood Mining, looking for unusual expenditures or payroll records from the winter of 1957 and the spring of 1958. She was searching for the names of the men Blackwood might have hired to carry out his plan, accomplices who may have been paid for their work and their silence. It was a long shot, but she knew that greed often left a paper trail, even decades later. Alistair's archival research and Ramirez's police work began to converge, painting a picture of a conspiracy that was both brutal in its execution and brilliant in its conception. The blizzard was not a tragic coincidence. It was the perfect cover. The isolation of the abbey was not a testament to the monks' faith. It was a strategic vulnerability exploited by their killer. The official story was not a mistake. It was a deliberately crafted piece of fiction to ensure the crime would never be discovered. The initial shock of the discovery began to subside, replaced by a tense, determined urgency. Alistair and Ramirez knew they had one chance to solve this. The weight of the 22 vanished men rested on their shoulders. They had to unravel a 50-year-old plot, challenge a powerful patriarch, and force a town to confront the dark secret upon which it was built. The discovery of the body was the beginning, the key that unlocked the door to the past. The new investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of brittle, 50-year-old paper. Deputy Elena Ramirez sat opposite Alistair Finch in a cramped, borrowed office, the original 1958 case file for the disappearance of the St. Jude's Brotherhood spread between them. It was shockingly slim, its few pages yellowed and smelling of dust and decay. The official report was a masterpiece of brevity and assumption, concluding in less than 2 pages that the monks had willingly walked into the blizzard. There were no appendices, no detailed witness statements, no forensic notes beyond a cursory inventory of the undisturbed abbey. It was less an investigation and more a formal shrug of the shoulders, a bureaucratic closing of the book on a matter deemed an unsolvable act of God. Alistair, with his archivist's training, saw the file not for what it contained, but for what it omitted. There was no mention of Silas Blackwood's repeated aggressive offers to purchase the land, a fact his grandfather, Abbot Thomas Finch, had detailed with growing anxiety in his final letters. There was no log of interviews with Blackwood or his associates. The timeline of the final days was vague, built on conjecture rather than fact. It was a narrative constructed to support a predetermined conclusion. Ramirez, a trained investigator, saw something more sinister, a deliberate and profound dereliction of duty, so complete it bordered on complicity. The file wasn't just flawed, it felt like an intentional dead end designed to discourage any future inquiry. Their first step was to reconstruct the original investigation itself. Who was the sheriff who had so quickly accepted the pilgrimage narrative? His name was Arthur Miller, a man long since deceased, but whose family still lived in the region. Ramirez began digging into county financial records from the late 1950s, a tedious process of scrolling through microfilmed ledgers. She was looking for anything unusual, any sudden change in Sheriff Miller's financial status following the closure of the St. Jude case. Alistair, meanwhile, cross-referenced the Abbey's old supply logs with town business records, trying to build a picture of the monastery's interactions with the world outside its walls in the months leading up to the disappearance. The first crack in the official story came from Ramirez's diligent search. In the spring of 1959, less than a year after closing the case, Sheriff Arthur Miller purchased a 200-acre ranch, a property far beyond the means of a small-town public servant. The deed of sale was public record, but the source of his newfound wealth was not. It took another week of digging into private banking archives, accessed via a hard-won court order, to find the source. A substantial personal loan co-signed by a single guarantor. That guarantor was a 29-year-old Silas Blackwood. The loan, which was never repaid and quietly written off years later, was the smoking gun proving the original investigation had been compromised from the very beginning. With proof of a cover-up, the focus shifted from the what to the who and how. If Blackwood had paid the sheriff to close the case, what exactly was he paying to conceal? The team on the mountain, now armed with this new context, expanded their search. The initial forensic sweep of the wine cellar where Brother Michael was found yielded more clues. Analysis of the ice that had encased the body revealed trace elements consistent with the local water table, but also with chemical compounds used in commercial refrigerants of the era. This suggested the freezing process may have been artificially accelerated, a deliberate act to preserve the body and the secret it held, rather than a natural consequence of the cellar's temperature. The bullet extracted from Brother Michael's skull was a .22 caliber lead round nose fired from a rifle. Ballistics analysis in 1957 was rudimentary, but modern techniques could reveal more. The CBI lab determined the rifling pattern was common to several models of Mossberg and Winchester rifles popular in the 50s for hunting and ranching. It wasn't a direct link to a specific weapon, but it painted a picture of the tool used, not a specialized weapon, but a common firearm, the kind that would have been ubiquitous in a rural Colorado town. It was a weapon designed to be untraceable, a tool of convenience for a killer who knew the local terrain and culture intimately. Alistair turned his attention to the human element. While the original investigators had failed to conduct thorough interviews, perhaps the town's collective memory held details that had been overlooked. He and Ramirez began the delicate process of re-interviewing the town's oldest residents, people who were children or young adults in 1957. Most remembered the blizzard and the legend, their memories clouded by 50 years of accepted folklore. They spoke of Blackwood as a savior, the man who brought jobs and prosperity after the tragic loss of the monks. Their loyalty was a formidable wall built of gratitude and time. The breakthrough came from an 82-year-old woman named Clara Peterson, who had been a teenager in 1957. Her memory was sharp, her mind unclouded by the town's dominant narrative. She told them something that had never appeared in any official record. On the afternoon the blizzard hit, from her family's farm on the valley floor, she had watched the road leading up to the Abbey. She saw Silas Blackwood's distinctive red flatbed truck making its way up the mountain, but it wasn't alone. Following close behind was a second, larger truck, a canvas-covered vehicle she didn't recognize, filled with what looked like several men huddled against the wind. Her father had remarked on it, wondering who would be foolish enough to head into the high country with such a storm coming. This testimony was explosive. Blackwood's public story for 50 years had been consistent. He had visited the abbot that morning, made his final offer, and returned to Ouray to wait out the storm in town. He claimed to have been at the local saloon with a dozen other men when the blizzard hit its peak. Clara Peterson's memory directly contradicted this long-held alibi. If she was right, Blackwood had not returned to town, but had instead gone up to the Abbey with a group of unknown men on the very night the monks vanished. What possible reason could he have for taking a work crew into a historic blizzard to a place he claimed had no further business with him? Armed with this new witness account, Ramirez began to search for any record of men employed by Blackwood in the winter of 1957. His early company payrolls were conveniently incomplete, with records for that specific period officially lost in a clerical fire in the early 1960s. It was another dead end that felt too convenient to be accidental. The conspiracy of silence was not just social, it was bureaucratic. Every path they took seemed to lead to a carefully constructed wall, erected decades ago to protect a single, terrible secret. The men on that second truck were ghosts, their identities seemingly erased from history. Meanwhile, the forensic team on the mountain made another significant discovery. The analysis of the mortar used to construct the false wall in the cellar was complete. Geologists confirmed it contained a unique type of quartz aggregate, traceable to a single small quarry. That quarry, historical records showed, had been exclusively owned and operated by Blackwood Mining in 1957. It was a direct physical link between the tomb of Brother Michael and Silas Blackwood's industrial operations. He hadn't just orchestrated the crime, he had supplied the materials for the cover-up from his own backyard. This was the kind of hard evidence that could be presented to a jury. The ground-penetrating radar team finally reported an anomaly. About 200 yards from the chapel ruins near a steep cliff face, their equipment detected a large, deep disturbance in the bedrock. It wasn't a natural formation. The shape was too regular, too rectangular. It was consistent with an old mineshaft entrance, one that did not appear on any of the Abbey's historical blueprints or Blackwood's own publicly filed geological surveys. It was a hidden place, deliberately omitted from the official maps. The team began preparations for a difficult and dangerous excavation, believing they may have finally found the resting place of the other 21 monks. Alistair felt a cold dread mixed with a grim sense of validation. He cross-referenced the GPR location with his grandfather's letters. In his final entry, the abbot had written about the deep silences of the earth, a phrase Alistair had always interpreted metaphorically. Now he wondered if it was a literal clue, a final desperate hint at where his brothers would be taken. The investigation was peeling back layers of a crime that was more brutal and premeditated than they could have imagined. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was a planned extermination and a meticulous, industrial-scale disposal of the evidence. The weight of these new findings, the compromised sheriff, the eyewitness placing Blackwood at the scene with other men, the mortar from his quarry, and the potential mass grave in an unlisted mine was enough to act. Deputy Ramirez, with the full backing of the CBI, secured a warrant to interview Silas Blackwood. It was time to confront the patriarch to see if the cracks in his 50-year-old story would finally shatter under pressure. The town watched, the air thick with a tension that had been building for half a century. The legend was dead. The trial of its architect was about to begin. The interview took place at Blackwood's estate, a sprawling mansion of glass and timber that offered a panoramic view of the mountains he had conquered. Silas Blackwood, at 85, was physically frail, leaning on a polished oak cane, but his eyes were as sharp and calculating as ever. He greeted Ramirez and Alistair with a practiced grandfatherly charm, offering them coffee and expressing his eagerness to assist in bringing this painful chapter to a just conclusion. The performance was flawless, the picture of a concerned community leader. Alistair felt a wave of nausea, recognizing the predatory charisma his grandfather had described. Ramirez began methodically, laying out the evidence without emotion. She started with Sheriff Miller's loan. Blackwood smiled faintly, dismissing it as an act of charity. "Arthur was a good man, but he was terrible with money," he said smoothly. "I helped him out. In those days, that's what neighbors did for each other. To suggest it was anything more is an insult to his memory. He had an answer for everything, a carefully polished narrative of philanthropy and community spirit that deflected any hint of malice. His control was absolute. his composure unshakable. She then brought up Clara Peterson's testimony about the 2 trucks heading up to the Abbey during the storm. For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Blackwood's face before being instantly suppressed. "An old woman's memory of a night 50 years ago," he scoffed gently. "Elena, you must know how unreliable such things are. The blizzard was terrible. People saw all sorts of things. I was in town. Dozens of men can attest to it." He was relying on the fact that most of those men were now dead, their testimony impossible to verify. He was using the passage of time as his most powerful shield. Next, Ramirez presented the geological report on the mortar from the false wall, linking it directly to his private quarry. Blackwood leaned back, steepling his fingers. "My quarry supplied stone and mortar to half the county back then," he replied, his voice calm and reasonable. "Anyone could have bought a few bags of mix. It proves nothing, other than that the killer used local materials. Are you suggesting I personally bricked up that poor man in the cellar?" The question hung in the air, a confident challenge to their entire investigation. He was daring them to make the accusation directly. It was then that Alistair spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. He didn't present evidence, he asked a question. "Mr. Blackwood, in your public statement after Brother Michael was found, you described the scene inside the Abbey as the search party founded in 1958. You mentioned the half-eaten bowls of stew on the refectory tables." Alistair paused, letting the silence stretch. "That detail, the stew, was never released to the public. It was only in Sheriff Miller's private notes. How did you know what they had been eating for their final meal?" The room fell silent. The grandfatherly mask on Silas Blackwood's face did not slip, but the light in his eyes hardened into something cold and dangerous. He had made a mistake, a small, arrogant slip, a detail shared to add authenticity to his feigned grief, but one that placed him at the scene with knowledge no innocent man could possess. For a long moment he said nothing, his mind clearly racing for an escape route from the trap Alistair had just sprung. The carefully constructed facade had finally, irrevocably cracked. Blackwood eventually recovered, offering a weak explanation that the sheriff must have told him the detail years ago, a piece of tragic trivia that had simply stuck in his mind. But the damage was done. The lie was transparent, the recovery clumsy. He knew it, and they knew it. The interview concluded shortly after, with Blackwood's lawyers ending the conversation. As they left the opulent estate, Alistair and Ramirez knew they were closer than ever. They had rattled him, forced an error. They had proven he was lying, not just about his alibi, but about his presence at the crime scene. The investigation now had a singular focus, breaking Blackwood's story completely. They had the circumstantial links, the motive, and now a direct lie that pointed to guilty knowledge. But a conviction would require more. It would require something that spoke directly from the past, something Blackwood couldn't dismiss as a faulty memory or a coincidence. They needed a witness who couldn't be intimidated or discredited, a voice from the grave that could narrate the events of that terrible night. Alistair returned to his grandfather's letters and the Abbey blueprints, his search now imbued with a desperate urgency. He was no longer just looking for clues, he was looking for a hiding place. He was convinced that Abbot Thomas Finch, a man of profound intellect and foresight, would have anticipated his own death. He would not have allowed his community to be erased without leaving a record. Somewhere within the ruins of St. Jude's, a final testament had to be waiting. The question was no longer if the proof existed, but where the abbot had hidden it. The team preparing to excavate the suspected mine shaft reported they were ready to begin. It was a slow, dangerous process, requiring shoring up the unstable ground before they could even begin to dig. The world's media was now camped out at the base of the mountain, their cameras pointed at the ruins, waiting for the next grim revelation. The entire town of Ouray seemed to be holding its breath. caught between the revered founder who had given them everything and the horrifying possibility that he had taken everything from the men who came before. The pressure on the investigation was immense. Blackwood's legal team was already filing motions to block further searches of his property, accusing the CBI of a witch hunt based on flimsy evidence and the wild theories of a grieving relative. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the secrets of the past and another against the power and influence of the man who had buried them. They were winning, but they knew their victory was still fragile, their case built on a chain of evidence that Blackwood was actively trying to break. Alistair spread the faded architectural drawing of the main chapel on the table. His eyes traced the thick lines representing the foundation stones, the very base upon which the entire abbey was built. He recalled a phrase from his grandfather's writings about the church being built upon the rock of faith and the testimony of the apostles. He had always read it as scripture, but what if it wasn't? What if, like the deep silences of the earth, it was another literal, final clue, a testimony hidden within the foundation itself? The focus of the entire case began to pivot. While the search for the bodies in the mineshaft continued, a new, more targeted search began. Alistair believed the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, the proof trophy that would incriminate Blackwood beyond any doubt, was not a body, but a story. It was a written account, a final journal entry or a signed letter secreted away in the last moments by a man who knew he was about to die, but was determined that the truth would not die with him. Ramirez worked to get a new warrant, this one based on Alistair's increasingly plausible theory. They needed permission to do something unprecedented, to excavate the very cornerstone of the ruined chapel. It was a long shot, a theory based on literary interpretation and a grandson's intuition. But after Blackwood's slip-up, they were convinced that the key to the entire mystery lay in something the killers had overlooked, something they never would have thought to search for in the chaos of that blizzard night. The meticulous staging of the crime scene, the half-eaten meals, the open books, suddenly made perfect sense. It was designed to create a narrative of a sudden, peaceful departure. Who would think to stage such a scene? Not common thugs, but a calculating mind, a storyteller crafting a fiction to conceal a horrific fact. Blackwood had planned not just the murders, but the myth that would follow. He had considered everything except the possibility that his victims might have a final say. The town of Ouray was a community on edge, its foundational myth crumbling into dust. The story of the lost pilgrims had been a source of identity, a sad but romantic piece of history. Now it was being replaced by a brutal noir, a tale of greed, murder, and a 50-year conspiracy of silence. The prosperity Blackwood had brought to the town now felt tainted, the fruits of a poisoned tree. The residents looked at the mountain not with a sense of awe, but with a growing dread of what other truths it was waiting to reveal. As the CBI team secured the warrant to excavate the chapel's foundation, Alistair felt a surge of adrenaline. He was on the verge of either vindicating his grandfather or following a ghost down a path of false hope. He knew that whatever they found or failed to find in that cornerstone would determine the final outcome of the investigation. The entire case now rested on the hope that Abbot Thomas Finch's faith in the future was as strong as his faith in God. The reconstruction of the truth was nearly complete. They had dismantled the official story, exposed the original cover-up, and broken the alibi of their prime suspect. They had followed a trail of evidence from a frozen body in a cellar to a potential mass grave in a hidden mine. They had forced a powerful man into a lie that revealed his guilt. All the pieces were on the board, pointing to a single, monstrous conclusion about what happened on that stormy night in 1957. They had exposed the lie that Silas Blackwood had so carefully constructed. The narrative of a peaceful pilgrimage had been shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a cold-blooded massacre. The question was no longer whether Blackwood was guilty, but how to prove it in a way that his power and wealth could not overcome. They needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed a confession. What they didn't know was that they were about to find one, written in a steady hand, by a man who had been waiting half a century to testify. The fortress of lies Blackwood had built was about to be brought down by the one thing he had never accounted for, a final defiant act of record-keeping. The truth had been preserved not in ice, but in ink. The excavation of the chapel's cornerstone began under the cold, watchful eye of the San Juan peaks. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and anticipation, was punctuated only by the rhythmic clang of steel on stone and the quiet commands of the forensic team. Alistair Finch stood apart, his hands clenched, watching as the crew carefully drilled and chiseled around the massive granite block. This was the culmination of his life's unspoken question, a theory built on a grandson's faith in a man he'd never met. Every strike of the hammer felt like a beat of a heart that had been silent for 50 years, a countdown to either vindication or devastating failure. With a final grating groan, the cornerstone was levered free from its ancient bed. The space beneath was dark and hollow, a small man-made cavity that had been waiting in the darkness for half a century. A technician reached into the void, his gloved hand disappearing for a moment, before re-emerging with a small metal box, its surface tarnished but intact. It was a simple tin document box, the kind used for storing deeds or important papers, sealed with a thick, hardened layer of wax around its edges. It was a relic sealed against the ravages of time, a final, desperate act of preservation. Alistair felt the air leave his lungs. He approached the box as if it were a sacred object, his archivist's instincts battling with the overwhelming emotional weight of the moment. He recognized the tin. An identical one had sat on his grandfather's desk in old family photographs. Deputy Ramirez placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of both support and official procedure. The box was carefully cleaned and transported to a makeshift field lab, where its contents would be revealed under controlled conditions. The silence that followed its discovery was heavier and more profound than any sound, a vacuum of held breath and unspoken certainty. Inside the lab, the wax seal was painstakingly removed. As the lid was lifted, the faint, dry scent of old paper filled the air. There, nestled within the tin, was a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the simple cross of St. Jude's. Its pages were filled with the elegant, steady script of Abbot Thomas Finch. The final entry was dated December 12, 1957. Alistair took the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to the last marked page. The ink was faded but perfectly legible, a voice speaking clearly from the abyss of the past, ready to give its testimony. The last pages of the journal were a harrowing, minute-by-minute account of the Abbey's final hours. Abbot Finch described Silas Blackwood arriving with a dozen rough-looking men, not as a guest seeking shelter from the storm, but as a conqueror. The narrative was chillingly precise, detailing how the radio was disabled and the monks were rounded up under the pretense of a security concern. The abbot wrote of Blackwood's final chilling monologue, a declaration that the mountain had chosen him, not God, and that the monks were merely trespassers on his future. It was a confession written by the victim, a prosecutor's closing argument from beyond the grave. The journal was the irrefutable proof they needed. It was a direct first-hand account that named Silas Blackwood as the architect of the massacre and identified his men as contract workers from a distant mining camp. It detailed the systematic executions in the chapel, the very place they now stood, and the abbot's final moments as he heard the killers approaching his office. In a final desperate act, he had sealed his testimony in the cornerstone, a foundation of truth beneath a house of God, praying that one day it would be found. The document was more than evidence. It was a final defiant act of faith. Armed with the journal, Deputy Ramirez and Alistair Finch made their final trip to the Blackwood estate. This time, there was no pretense of a polite interview. They arrived with a search warrant for the property and an arrest warrant for Silas Blackwood. The old man met them in his grand library, his lawyers flanking him like sentinels. He wore a look of supreme arrogance, a belief in his own untouchable legacy that had been reinforced over 50 years. He saw the journal in Alistair's hands and scoffed, dismissing it as a potential forgery, a desperate ploy by a man obsessed with the past. Alistair didn't argue. He simply opened the journal to a specific page and began to read aloud. He read his grandfather's description of the final conversation between the abbot and Blackwood, which took place in the abbot's office. The journal quoted Blackwood's exact words, a promise that he would build an empire so vast that the monks would be remembered only as a quaint footnote to his own story. The passage ended with the abbot describing a small silver locket Blackwood wore, a gift from his mother, which he nervously twisted as he gave the final order to his men. At the mention of the locket, Silas Blackwood froze. His hand instinctively went to his chest, where the chain still rested beneath his shirt. It was a detail no forger could have known, a private memory he had long since buried. The blood drained from his face, the carefully maintained mask of the venerable patriarch shattering into 1,000 pieces. In that moment, the 85-year-old titan of industry was gone, replaced by the ghost of a ruthless 29-year-old killer, finally cornered by a truth he thought he had murdered and buried 5 decades ago. The room was silent save for the old man's ragged breathing. His confession came not in a torrent, but in a weary, defeated whisper. He admitted everything. The motive was not just the silver. It was the insult of Abbot Finch's refusal. The abbot's quiet, unshakable faith was a mirror that reflected Blackwood's own avarice, a judgment he could not tolerate. He saw the monk's piety not as virtue, but as weakness, an obstacle to the manifest destiny he believed was his right. He had to erase them, not just from the land but from history itself, replacing their story of faith with his own story of progress. He recounted the night with a chilling lack of emotion, a businessman describing a difficult but necessary acquisition. He confirmed his men disposed of the 21 bodies in an old abandoned silver mine shaft, dynamiting the entrance to seal it forever. He explained that Brother Michael, the bursar, had been killed first in the cellar because he was attempting to hide the abbey's financial ledgers, which documented Blackwood's rejected offers. They had intended to move his body with the others, but the storm's ferocity forced them to retreat, leaving them to improvise the false wall as a hasty, temporary solution they never dared to revisit. The confession was a brutal epilogue to a 50-year lie. It laid bare the cold, calculated heart of the town's foundational myth, the prosperity of Auray, the philanthropic legacy of Silas Blackwood, the very identity of the community. It was all built upon a mass grave, fertilized by the blood of 22 innocent men. The legend of the lost pilgrims was not a tragedy. It was an alibi, the most successful and long-running cover story in the state's history. The truth, when it finally came, was as ugly and unforgiving as the mountain winter that had first concealed it. Following the confession, the excavation at the abandoned mine shaft began. It took weeks, but eventually the remains of the 21 missing monks were recovered. They were brought down from the mountain one by one, their silent procession, a final, somber journey home. The discovery confirmed every detail of Blackwood's story and every word of Abbot Finch's journal. The ghosts of St. Jude's were no longer lost. They had been found, their identities restored, their story finally ready to be told truthfully. The town of Ouray watched in collective shame and sorrow, forced to confront the monstrous secret it had unknowingly protected. Silas Blackwood was arrested and charged with 22 counts of first-degree murder. His immense wealth and powerful legal team could do nothing to stop the avalanche of evidence against him. The journal, corroborated by his own detailed confession and the discovery of the bodies, made for an unassailable case. He would live out his remaining days in a prison cell, the empire he built on a foundation of blood and lies now a monument to his own hubris. Justice, though delayed by half a century, was absolute and undeniable. A memorial service was held for the lost brotherhood of St. Jude's. The 22 monks were laid to rest in a new cemetery consecrated on the grounds of their former home. Alistair Finch delivered the eulogy, his voice steady as he spoke, not of legends or ghosts, but of his grandfather, Thomas Finch, and his brothers, men of quiet faith and unyielding principle, who had been silenced but never truly erased. He had found the truth he had sought, a brutal and painful closure that nonetheless allowed the wound in his family's history to finally begin to heal. The town of Ouray began the slow, difficult process of redefining itself. The name Blackwood was quietly removed from buildings and plaques. The story told to tourists changed, transformed from a romantic ghost tale into a sobering lesson about the cost of greed and the power of truth. The community had to learn to live with its new history, to accept that its prosperity was born from a great crime. It was a painful reckoning, but it was an honest one, a chance to build a new identity on a foundation of fact rather than fiction. The Journal of Abbot Thomas Finch was placed in a state museum, its final harrowing pages displayed for all to see. It became a testament not only to the tragedy, but to the enduring power of the written word. It was a final sermon from a man who believed that truth, like faith, was a light that no amount of darkness could ever truly extinguish. His final act was not one of despair but of profound hope, a belief that someone, someday, would come looking for the story he had refused to let die with him. The silence of St. Jude's was finally broken, replaced by a truth that echoed through the mountains and across the decades. The story was a stark reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes by the victims, whose quiet testimony waits patiently in the dark places of the earth. It proved that no secret is buried so deep, no lie is so powerful, and no amount of time is so great that it can prevent the truth from eventually finding its way into the light.